Give a brief intro and we can begin. Right.
Okay.
Namaste and greetings. I, Tripta Behra, researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav एवं नीति अनुसंधान संस्थान, Nai Delhi, extend my warmest welcome to you all to IMPRI Web Policy Learning. We are gathered today for day 3 of an online international autumn school program, a 1-month immersive online intermediate certificate training course on contours of the public policy in India in the Amrit Kaal. This training program is organized by IMPRI, Center for the Study of Finance and Economics, CSFE. This course will be chaired by Professor Mukul, visiting distinguished professor IMPRI, former professor, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore, NUS. The panel of conveners comprises of Dr. Devendra Singh, Senior Visiting Fellow IMPRI, Dr. Simi Mehta, CEO and Editorial Director IMPRI, and Dr. Arjun Kumar, Director IMPRI. The experts for today's session are Mr. V. Ramakrishnan, Professor Sacchidananda Mukherjee, and Dr. Aashish Chandorkar. I welcome all the participants for this enlightening deliberation, and thank you for being interested and putting your time, energy, and efforts into understanding emerging issues pertaining to the Indian subcontinent and helping us to bring together the practitioners and participants through this course for impactful policy research and action. We have also shared the course outline and reading resources in your email for your kind perusal. Before we start today's session, I would like to remind the housekeeping announcements once again. Please join the meeting on time. There will be a Q&A session after each presentation. Kindly share your questions in the Q&A box. The questions must not be posted as an anonymous attendee. Ensure that your questions are precise, and kindly refrain from making any general comments in the questions to save time. Now, without further ado, let us start the program. First, I would like to invite Professor Mukul to start the program and give his opening remarks. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good evening to everyone. Today, we have 3 quite different topics to learn from by 3 distinguished experts. The first is on citizen-centric public policies. I was just listening to the G20 declaration of 83 paragraphs, and a lot of it related to the citizen-centricness, but on a wider scale. Now, of course, multilateral meetings to implement it is a much more complex task than doing it in a nation. But even in a nation, it is quite important to have the mindset and the capacities to do citizen-centric policies. Ram had already laid foundations for it yesterday, so we look forward to his presentation today. Then we have what was our national project called Goods and Services Tax. The first time that we got 17 taxes amalgamated into one nation, one tax, and it has a tremendous dynamic effects. The reform was very complex. It's still ongoing. There are still things to be done, and Professor Mukherjee will enlighten us. Lastly, we are indeed quite happy to have Aashish Chandorkar from Geneva. He is in India's WTO office there in Geneva as an economist, and to learn about the external aspects, and particularly the trade-related external aspects of public policies. We have 3 speakers. I request each speaker to have time discipline so that the next speaker can get the full quota that is allocated to him. Mr. Ram, please.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen now. Right. Yeah, there it is. Yeah. Are you able to see it?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Okay, now I have to play it. Okay. Thank you, IMPRI, once again, for helping me weave the story of how public policy formulation has to center around for citizens. It has to be for the citizen by the policy makers. I'm going to take a very unusual path, and as usual, I'll always start with my two tigers. Policy making is the compass and strategy is the GPS. Yesterday, I pointed out that policy has to be derived from strategy. And a simple one-liner for a program such as this is very simple. Your strategy is to improve the lot of the citizen, period. Everything else derives from it, whether it is security, defense, food, agriculture, health, transport. The single point attention is the welfare of the citizen. That's going to be the theme for this afternoon. And unless both are combined like the tiger, public policy will be extinct. It can't fight the nature. Right? Session outline. Who are the nation's customers? Right? Now, just to put in an old school typical fata, many policymakers think of customers as customers. Right? Now, that's somewhere along the line that policy goes off track, especially in the early days of this, where we felt that the command and control economy and such like that. It was about the remnants of the freedom struggle. It is not about really focusing on the people, and the focusing on the people has come about only in the last few years. We need to understand what do they want and what do they need. Economists talk very eloquently about separating wants and needs. But very rarely have I seen policy specifically focused on wants and policy specifically focused on needs. Right? I will cover that now. I'm going to be looking at Maslow's hierarchies of wants and needs. And I'm going to use a very strange thing. I'm going to use the 2020 budget to relate it to Maslow and to show you how policies impact citizens. Right? This is going to be the broad coverage that I'm going to be doing. We'll have a Q&A after that. Now, in any public policy, it's very commonsensical that these three elements have to work synchronously: the economic dimension, the political aspects, and the social requirements. Now, it's only where the three Venn diagram, this is a Venn diagram basically, it's only number 7. It's only where all three meet and see eye to eye, are coherent and cogent, is a benefit delivered. And the citizen sits in at number 7. The rest of all your policies for political things, all your government bonds, whether you're economic theory, social schemes, all that is fantastic. But it's only where the three meet. It is that interface which defines what the citizen is. Right? Otherwise, you can see there are all in the interested groups: 1 to 4, 1 to 6, 2 to 6, 5 to 3, 3 to 4, so on and so forth. And many of these are represented by NGOs, and we know what's the consequence. Right? So the customers is very simple. What is their expectation? Do we know? Or do we claim to know? Right? Citizens of the country, does the man living in poverty have the same expectations as a super rich citizen? Think about it. And should policy address only the tax bracket at 22%, or should it also address the bottom of the pyramid, as Prahlad called it? And what are his expectations and desires? And more importantly, are these fixed? A guy who's living in a Jhopatpatti, if the government gives him a 5 lakh house to live in comfort, is he going to stay static, or are his children going to aspire for an apartment, maybe a 2-bedroom apartment in a high rise? So this value dimension I explained yesterday, and that is very central to public policy formulation, because that is citizen centricity. There is nothing called a static public policy. It has to evolve. Then we have regional neighbors, the international dimensions. What do they seek? Very simple. They want trade, they want security, and preferably a good flow of dollars. And the international community, which promote global harmony and well-being, which is exactly what the focus of the G20 has been. And perhaps this G20 has elevated the level of policy think within the international community. I have not read all of it today. I've been very busy, but I will read it up. And who are the citizens? Simply put, they are the people below the poverty line. They are the middle class, the upper middle class, and the super rich. These are the four basic divisions that you would see in any society. Okay, there are upper, lower, middle class, lower, middle, upper class. Economists have wonderful ways of defining it. Whichever way you define it, you take a broad brush and arrive at these four. I'm not saying this is limited. This can be definitely fine-grained and fine-tuned, but I'm not an economist to go about doing that in a micro level. Certainly, this is not what we want, where, I mean, this is all R.K. Lakshman's notings also on it, where we want the BPL guy tucking along the super rich, which has happened for many, many years in many, many countries, right? It's a national program, as you see in the corner, right? Now, when expectations are met, it promotes satisfaction. Performance is about happens when expectations are met. I don't know, there's something that's blocking the screen on my side. Okay, I can't do much about it. Right. Expectation is a desire, a hope, a wish that something good will address the needs and wants that I have. In a mathematical equation, satisfaction is equal to performance minus expectations. We are all adults here, so S is equal to P minus X. Please don't transpose the equation because then it becomes pretty vulgar, right? This ought to be the purpose and focus of public policy. Can we deliver satisfaction to all the four constituents? Partially, yes. Fully, no. But over time, can we address it? This is a superb cartoon which says what are the expectations and what is delivered. This is a very old one. R.K. Lakshman's, when I hit cartoons and budget, the only thing I got was R.K. Lakshman. Nobody else seems to have a sense of humor about budgets, right? So you cannot, and if you don't understand the expectations of the common man, this is what will happen. He'll get weighed down, right? So your budget proposals are brilliant, right? And I don't know who that Sardarji in the picture refers to, but I'll stay quiet about it, right? Now,
I think it is Swan Singh.
Swaran Singh.
Swan Singh, he was the finance minister for a while.
Right, okay. But we can mean it to cover a whole range of Sardarjis. We won't go too much about it. Right? Now, how are expectations quantified? A desire, a hope, how are you quantifying it? I'm giving you a framework. Separate the needs and the wants. Look at the customer value proposition and look at the customer value migration. And explained these in detail yesterday. So I'll take off from there. Now, Abraham Maslow was the first to quantify it, and it is very clear. It is a five-layered onion that has to be peeled. All of us, whether super rich or poor, we need to have a physiological dimension to it. It's breathing, food, water, sex, sleep, homeostasis, and excretion. Now, homeostasis is a very important dimension in policy making. Homeostasis simply means stability. But it is not a fixed stability. It is a dynamic stability. Those of you who are in electronics will understand that when a servo motor is maintained at dynamic zero, it has got a positive current and a negative current flowing through it simultaneously. So the net effect on the shaft is zero energy. But the moment energy moves in the other direction, it takes off. And that happens when per capita income reaches certain thresholds, you see a lot of takeoff. So that homeostasis is something that's ignored in many policy making because there has to be a systematic approach to understand what is the stability, what will disrupt the stability, and what will cause the changes to flow. Safety, security of body, employment, resources, morality, the family, health, property, right? This is self-evident. Love and belonging, friendship, family, and sexual intimacy. Now, these are fundamental requirements, and there's no point playing hoo-hoo about it. This is the reality of life. Esteem, self-esteem, confidence, achievement, respect of others, respect by others. Now, you will notice that societies that hold themselves in high self-esteem are big builders. If you look at the Pandya Chola dynasties in the south, if you look at the Hoysalas, if you look at the Kakatiyas, if you look at the Vijayanagaram kingdoms, they all thought very highly of themselves and built massive structures. So one way of expressing self-esteem and confidence is publicly proclaiming what you believe in. Right? The same thing happened during the Baroque and the Rococo periods in Europe, where there was very flamboyant buildings coming about it, and before that in Greek architecture and Roman architecture and so on. I won't get into it. And then there is self-actualization, something that is very unique and abundant in India. It's about morality, it's about creativity, it's about spontaneity, it's about problem solving, lack of prejudice, and acceptance of facts. Now, this is the broad construct. This is a nice construct, but how do we use it? Right? It's exactly that. I've repeated the same thing. I've not done anything different, except I've added two dimensions, the quality of life and the quality of living. So what goes below the third level is quality of life, living. And what goes above it is quality of life. And Mukul and I often exchange notes. Many policymakers mix up the two. They are not the same. Right? Quality of living is basically about providing the basic necessities for life, basically providing safety, ensuring love and belonging, which is where love and belonging seems easy. But today you have the LGBT community. I want to do this. I want to do that. We can see that our courts are very complex in this relationship. And the homeostasis dimension, I cannot stress enough, in all three spheres, because once you reach physiological security, you look for safety. If you look for safety, you look for love and belonging. And if you have all three, and there is a stability in your life, you look at esteem, and then all of us go into Vanvasan for self-actualization. Right? The bottom half is the needs, and the top half the wants. The needs are not negotiable. Every society has it, maybe in different dimensions. Right? But wants are optional, and they are very difficult to quantify, because the wants of a rich man in the northeast of India will be different from that in the southwest of India. So these require also policy facilitation. For example, self-actualization. Many people love to go on yatras, to Kailash, Manasarovar and stuff like that. Those are all self-actualization exercises. You need a policy for it. You need security for it. You need safety from floods, from landslips, and so on and so forth. So I'm just taking common everyday examples to say how these two can be integrated. And this framework, if it's used by policymakers, can be extremely powerful. This can, of course, be micro-grained and, detailed, as I mentioned yesterday. But this should not happen. But this does tell you, what is it that the Janta is looking for? Give us food, give us lower prices, right? And you can see the man in the dark hair, I suspect, is Mr. C. Subramaniam, the then finance minister, right? And it's apocryphal to believe, I'm sure the country is behind us, Mr. PM. This is self-defeating policy making. In fact, it's not policy making at all. This is ad hoc allocation of costs. Now, how do you go about it? Again, I come back to the issue. Fundamentally, if you're going to get into public policy, you cannot separate it from outcomes. What has to be delivered to whom, by when, at what cost? For every policy framework, this has to be crystal clear. Will it stay static? No. Should there be homeostasis? Yes. For example, if you are lowered your tax rate to 22% and effective 25%, don't go on fiddling with it. Give stability. But your GST, in the initial years, there was no stability because you had to go on changing. You were finding the level. But today it has reached a certain level. By no means complete, but it has had some level of homeostasis. That's what I mean by dynamic neutrality. So the customer, you have to capture the value, and you capture the value through a functionality relationship element, and that leads to economic growth. Now, the image and brand equity of the policymaker, the sort of quality that they deliver, the costs that they manage, and the delivery that they ensure, and the technology they use ensures profitable growth, and that's the value delivery. Unless a nation grows, it cannot prosper. But unless a nation grows profitably, in which the current account deficit, fiscal deficit, etc., are well managed, you're going to have inflation, which is not very profitable growth, right? It's detrimental growth. I have run business for my family when the interest rate was 21% and the tax rate was 97%, right? That's not homeostasis, that's madness, right? Okay, of course I have a car, but I don't have a road to drive it on. This is a powerful story about how policymakers want to encourage auto industry. But as I mentioned yesterday, inner city traffic is maddening, absolutely maddening. It cannot go separately. It has to go hand in hand. So now what is the value proposition? I'll detail it again. A clear set of customer benefiting attributes. A value or a cost benefit that the customer gets. A quality framework that is meaningful to the customer, a time and a reach dimension, impact on quality. No point saying I'll give you this quality 25 years after your date. How the relationship benefits the customer. The image of the group presenting the budget and the technology. These are the same factors that I'd shown in my earlier slide, but I'm expanding on it to say this is how the implications are. And the bottom line is, it begins and ends with the customer. In this case, the citizen. Right? Now, are they the same value proposition of the main players? I make this chart. You can do this exercise. Normally, I'm leaving this with the students who are attending because you can go out and do it on your own. Normally, I will take you through a half-an-hour session through different things, giving you different examples of the GDP range and stuff, the per capita range and stuff like that. You'll realize, just take physiological safety. Do you think a guy who's living in a Jhopatpatti has the same concerns as the super rich guy? Super rich guy wants CCTV for safety. This guy, what does he use? Even if he gets to do a lock on his house, he's fortunate. Physiological needs. Does he get 3 square meals a day? Is the meal that a super rich guy throws out, is it equivalent to feeding four other people who are down the line, down the pyramid? So this framework helps translate the Maslow's idea into the value proposition of the segment, population segment, or the citizen segment that you're evaluating. Obviously, in each segment, there will be many categories and subcategories, right? There will be people in the sub 50,000 per capita, people in the sub 1 lakh, people in the sub 1.5 lakh, so on and so forth. That can be fine-grained fairly easily when data is available. I'm going to use the 2020 budget to explore how public policy has potential to shape well-being and prosperity and superpose it on Maslow. Why do I use 2020? I think it is a seminal budget, and it happened in the midst of COVID or just before COVID. And I think the spin-off from this has been phenomenal. The billiard ball effect of the 2020 budget is still being felt, though the government is wont to announcing new schemes. But we must remember, bulk of the growth schemes that we see today were based out of the 2020 budget. I'm covering only a few. I'm not covering all. It's very interesting. The person who made India's first budget was the founder of Standard Chartered Bank. A government budget is a tool to prevent the economy from inflation and deflation and maintain economic stability. The overall level of employment and prices of the country in the economy depends upon the level of aggregate demand. During the time of deflation, deficit budgets and policy are used to maintain stability in the economy. What is the overarching comment in this saying? It is about stability, 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 stability. Can you have economic and social stability without political stability? When there is social churn, can you have political stability? Can you have economic stability? So we need to understand that policy making has to consider stability, homeostasis, as we keep referring to it. Now, I won't go too much into it. Budget allocations are key levels indicator of the importance. 3 main: set the goals for future actions, implement the strategies, compare the actual results. This is one element, but unfortunately, as I mentioned yesterday, the report happens only once a year when the chief economic advisor analyzes it. Probably you get the other things in bits and pieces through the year. A budget is a roadmap. It's a planning orientation. Now, the roadmap is important simply because the value propositions keep changing. So there's no point trying to do something for one segment of people without providing a way forward for them in the near term, medium term, and long term. Budget can also be used as income and expense wish lists. That is what it has been in my estimate for many, many years in this country. We only looked when I came into business, the only thing we were worried about budget was what's going to be the increase in excise, what is going to be the sales tax that's going to happen at the state level, what's going to be the inflation rate. These were the only things that were considered. Right? So this is exactly the fun that they had in the pre-budget days. You're squeezing the guy looking for resources, you're shaking down the population, you're extracting additional revenue. You were not focused on meeting the needs of the citizen. This cartoon is extraordinarily powerful. It shows you how we were entirely focused on milking the citizen, not the welfare of the citizen. Right? Now, this is R.K. Lakshman, and the great man had did it years and years and years ago. Right? And I like the way the guy is looking for new resources from the shirt of the Aam Aadmi. Now, getting specifically into the budget, The theme was, it's an aspirational India, better standard of living. This is the quality of living. See, this is with access to education and better jobs for all sections of society. Whose need does this access primarily? BPL and the middle class, right? Now your NEET and other policies were derived from this. Economic development, sabka saath, sabka vikas, sabka vishwas. Of course, subsequently it has been modified and added. That is what I mean by stability with homeostasis. A caring society, both humane and compassionate. Antodeya, it became an article of faith. The insurance schemes that were providing for the BPL increase, so on and so forth. And of course, post 2020, this compassion made sure that we donated vaccines. This is the international dimension I mentioned earlier. We first, of course, serviced our regional neighbors and then gave it internationally. And of course, the food grain supply for 800 million people is no mean effort. That's what a caring society actually translates into a value proposition when it is implemented. The three components of the aspirational India: agriculture, irrigation, and rural development. Right. One thing is, of course, the handouts to the farmers. Whether it's right or wrong is, I'm not clear. Irrigation is still work in progress because it's a concurrent subject and there's lots of issues. We know the issues with Polavaram and the other issues. But rural development, roads, for example, water, for example, electricity, for example, this has been stoked enormously by this budget. Wellness, public health centers have been streamlined. And COVID, of course, forced a lot of wellness measures. Sanitation, we know what is happening on sanitation. Swachh Bharat became operative. Education and skills. We went, as I mentioned yesterday, we went on online education. We went on the Atal training schemes, so on and so forth. So this was a budget which started addressing the BPL and the middle class. It had very little for the rich because by the time taxes had been streamlined. There were 16 action points for agriculture, irrigation, and rural development. Now, that's the sort of translation of the purpose intent into a mission. Time-based, what has to be delivered to whom, by when, at what cost. Blue economy, fisheries, growing algae, seaweed, conservation, using the blue waterways. These were all seeded in this phase. Kisan Rail, Kisan Udan. We know what has happened to the railways as a consequence of this. We know that more goods are moving by rail. Cold supply chain network has started up. There are remote airways. There are goods being carried along the Ganga over 7 riverine systems into Asansol. All this is for the benefit of whom? As I mentioned yesterday again, all the people who are where this boat stops on the way to Asansol, on the banks, they are making a living. It addresses their needs. Network solar water pumps, we have used this very extensively with the NGOs here. It's a huge saving because even though electricity is available, it's increasing in cost. And in state like Tamil Nadu, today electricity costs around 9 rupees a unit, which is very expensive for the farmer. This also avoids stealing of electricity. Village storage schemes, the number of water tanks that have been replenished, the way the farmers have been encouraged is enormously substantial. Drinking water, hospitals, and disease prevention have all come out of this structure. Infrastructure, today we're talking about our road infrastructure being better than China. Did we even dare talk about roads 10 years ago? Right? What happened? Didn't earlier governments realize that roads are fundamental to economic growth? Didn't they know how to build roads? That is where the purpose and intent, the focus on the citizen, the focus on addressing his needs, quality of living and quality of life become important. Caring society, focus on women and child, on social welfare, on culture and tourism. The urban versus the rural. Environment and climate change. We India are leaders in climate change. We have some of the largest solar parks today. In fact, what I've been very busy today is I've been upgrading to a solar system where, people talk about solar very glibly. I have been using an Indian system for the last 12 years, where the self-consumption, that is the amount of energy that the system requires to maintain itself, is 30% of the battery. I've replaced it with the Swiss system, which uses 0.1% of the battery to replenish itself. See the savings? Right? Where I needed a 10 kilowatt solar panel, I'm now making do with a 6 kilowatt solar panel. Efficiency, effectiveness, economy, something that we discussed yesterday. Governance. A lot have been said about governance. I discussed this in depth yesterday. I showed you the graphic changes from the zones of comfort moving into different areas. There has been substantial improvement in governance, but is it the be all and end all of it? I think no, we have a long way to go. Very long way to go. For example, the power, I've discussed this again on this screen many times. The quality of power in India is the pits. Outside of Bombay, everywhere else, voltage fluctuation, frequency fluctuation, and power factor fluctuations are high. This is a very poor governance by the state and by the center. Again, I repeat, there are enormous industries which have come up around addressing the issues of bad and poor quality power. They are probably taking away 4 to 5% of GDP. That's a pseudo GDP that we need to understand. And that's the consequence. If the policy framing does not address the basic needs, people will find a way out of it because they have to address Maslow's needs. If you're talking about education, electricity, however costly, is required for the children to study. And all this question of surge protectors and stabilizers, all this. Have you ever seen this in countries that you visit overseas? Hardly. Right? So we need to understand that if you don't understand the basic needs and address it fully and comprehensively and provide the stability, people will find alternatives, which is not economical, it's not very efficient, but it will be effective from their framework, but may not be from the national framework. Taxation, right? We understand this. I won't go into it. Corporate taxes, as Mukul explained yesterday, are amongst the lowest in the world, right? I won't say amongst the lowest, but amongst the average in the world, right? And it cannot get any lower. We're still a developing economy. Population, I don't want to go through the statistics. What is the consequence of this good policy? You see, the GDP as per capita has grown. The 2021 dip is purely because of COVID, but then the surge afterwards. Now, this one key index to say that the earlier policy has worked, and for me, there is a sustained growth, 150 to 170. Will it grow further? Is something that we need to see. Should more changes have been made? Yeah, last year in 21 and 22, sure, and I think they have made the changes. So you're seeing the effect, and if you take this a 10-year cut, you will see what the effect is, right? But you will also see the growth rate has been static or incremental for many years, hardly growing at inflation, and then suddenly there is a rise. The reverse way of saying is we have had effective policy making, addressing the basic needs and wants of the citizen. This has been largely the story of our budgets. It's a good budget if you don't view it from the economic angle.
I don't think in India we'll ever get Lakshman again.
No, never.
Nobody did that kind of thing that he has done.
And what is more, not only did he get away with it, he was fated and dined for curing these fellows.
Yeah, this is in 1980.
1980, yeah. So what I'm trying to, I don't want to say the previous government did this or previous government did that. I'm just looking at the story timeline, and we decide for ourselves who did what, right? Now, this is another exercise that you can do. You take the budget, take the BPL. You have already decided what the Maslow effect is going to be on the similar table that I showed you earlier. Take those factors and plug it in, and you'll see that more or less you are always on the top half of the screen, the BPL and the middle class, right? Now, many of my friends, the wealthier friends, crib about it. But the fact is that the top 3% who are supposed to be aspirational are less than 3% of the country. Yes, we pay the taxes, we pay this, we pay that, all that is fine, right? But give it time when our average per capita increases, the taxation is expected to reach about 25, 27%, as Mukul showed yesterday. That's the sort of trend that's going to happen. And this is how I would see an understanding of a budget, not from mere numbers. Which constituency is served best, right? Should BPL be served for the next 40 years? I doubt it, because today the pyramid is shaped, as I said yesterday, like a triangle with a very broad base. It's going to become like a tower with a very broad middle and a flat top and a flat base. So it's going to become like a rectangular egg. When that happens, many of these things will change. You won't talk about water once you have it. You won't talk about sanitation once you have it. You don't go to Singapore and say, I have sanitation problems. You don't go to Singapore and say, I have internet problems. Right? You don't go to New York Of course, today they have had a lot of problems, but you don't say there's a lights out. Otherwise, how do you get to a 50-story building? In Bombay, you hardly get a power cut because the high rises are so good that you need to be there all the time. Right? Now, here is how this is a bad policy maker. Well, I finished the project on time and budget. That means I've given you too much time and too much money. Right? That's not what policy management is. This is about project management. This is a very clear indication. I mentioned that yesterday, I mentioned it again. Policy framers live by a scheme or a plan which works for 3 to 5 years. Essentially, they are projects. They're work in progress. They must understand what are the intricacies involved and not just be paper pushers in this sense. And last slide, how do you measure it? See, the basic philosophy is, I keep stressing on measurement. If you can't measure it, what can't be measured cannot be done. You can't say my temperature is high and provide an antibiotic or a pain relief medicine. You need specific numbers. You cannot say my BP is high. You need specific numbers. When you do a blood test, you have specific ranges. Similarly, my suggestion for policymakers, look at the quality of life. I've just chosen a few numbers: per capita income and Maslow's basic needs, because I wanted to fit it into a page, but obviously there's a session, this can go on. Quality of living, which is wealth, which is knowledge creation, it's aspirational. Drivers, right? The political integrity, the economic reliability, and the social relevance. This is the 3 factors I mentioned: the social, economic, and political. I'm now linking that. And how do you do that? If you link these, the enablers are the federal structure, which addresses the market realities, the states, which take care of the citizen. And let's be clear, the center does not take care of our citizens in our sort of federal structure. It provides all the means to support the citizen, but it's the states which have to handle it. The institutional or the outcome focus. Institutions, whether it is DRDO or whether it's Agricultural Ministry or Finance Ministry or XY R&D Ministry, it has to have an outcome focus. And private enterprise is very much a part of the enabler, because that's where jobs get created in mass numbers. And one of our problems is, the last 20 years, private enterprise has not been a job creator. Then the determinants, the strategic frameworks, policy formulation, oversight, and coordination skills. Now, the project management is about coordination skills. Then policy implementation, executive competence, resource management, and continuous improvement. Yesterday, I spoke about skill development and competency development. Here it features again. And lead versus lag, what sort of review systems do you have? And the foundation is your culture. What is your belief system? What are the values? What is the purpose? And what is the vision that you have for the country? Strategic competencies. Outcome definition is a strategic competency. I can tell you, I've done more than 200 workshops on outcomes. Everybody will agree with the theory and they give you beautiful definitions. But the moment I ask them to define outcomes for the business, they will start defining the activities that they need to do. Right? Program management, which is one level above project management. Legal knowledge is extremely important. Information architecture, information flow, information availability, project management, analytics, and the style of leadership, whether it's mission management, risk management, or learning and environment. You put all this together, you lay the foundation right, you will help to activate the determinants which will enable delivery of the political, economic, social hemostasis that I recommended or suggested to give you the quality of life and quality of living. So here is a complete summary of how I believe outcome-based public policy framing can have a very established framework. Of course, there's a lot of room for improvement. There's a lot of room for discussion and debate. I'm not saying by any means this is the be-all and end-all of it. This is a starting point. What more can be done with this? We can discuss. Thank you. I'll be happy to answer questions now.
Thank you so much, sir, for the presentation. I now request Mukul, sir, to provide his views, and then we can move on to the Q&A session.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Ram, this has been once again a very complex set of ideas explained in a relatively simple and entertaining way. There is a lot that it is, your slides are such that people have to go back again and again, yes. Not that you just look at it. So I request IMPRI to see that all the participants have got all the slides so they can go back to it. I think uh, uh, we are a bit ahead of time, so maybe 2 questions at the most. Are there any questions?
So none in the chat box. I request participants to kindly raise
Okay.
their hands if they have any.
Yeah, okay. Uh, maybe we can come back to it at a later date or later time so that the other speakers can make their presentation. We now move to Professor Mukherjee for GST.
Thank you very much, Mukul. I have an
Thank
engagement
you.
this evening. I have to be
Okay.
going. So if there are
Okay.
any questions and they are posted to me by email, I will definitely respond to it fully.
Right. Thank you. Appreciate that very much.
Thank you very much.
And,
Hope
Thank
this is
and
been
thank you again.
Q&A. There's one question. Should I answer that?
Yes, please.
How to focus? How to focus on
1 minute, Professor Mukherjee, please. Yeah.
How
Go
to
ahead.
focus on result-oriented policies when freebie policies are at the highest level? A very good question. Now, freebies are of two types. One, when there is a basic need for it. For example, during COVID, it was a necessity. But should it be continued? For example, the Right to Food Act, the Right to Education Act was a disaster. It gave freebies. And what the 2014 election clearly showed is that people don't value freebies. The self-respect and the esteem that I spoke about in Maslow's structure works even amongst the poorest of the poor. They have a sense of fair play. Yes, if you go on giving it free, they'll take it. But sooner than later, they will talk with the vote. So are freebies to be recommended? No. And I think it's high time that the courts step in and limit the freebies. In my state, it's all freebies. None of the young people want to work because they get rice, they get during elections, they get booze, they get biryani, they get $500 a day and works. So are freebies in any sense worth it? Considered answer is no. Is it necessary? Yes, to lift people up to a point. But beyond that, you just provide them the parachute and they have to float down to their own successes. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. We can now move to Professor Mukherjee on GST. Welcome.
Good evening, Professor Asad, and I thank you very much for inviting me for this online, I could say, workshop on public policy, because this is one of the unique forum that has started in India after COVID-19 and so I hope all of you can see my presentation. So today I will talk about mostly on what we have achieved through goods and services tax and what is the future reform that we need to make goods and services tax more, I could say, the simple and goods tax system. So if you ask me that what is the major achievement or what are the major achievement of goods and services tax and in terms of indirect tax reforms in India? I would say that goods and services tax has instituted a framework or design in indirect tax system which we haven't achieved for the last almost 50 years. So what was the problem? What was the challenges before implementation of comprehensive value-added tax in goods and services? The major problem that I think was two. The problem was the continuation of input tax credit. When the goods are moving from one state to another state, it breaks the chain of input tax credit. So designing a framework or designing a structure of any tax system in a federal country like ours was a challenge. And in that sense, integrated goods and services tax has done a wonderful job in integrating the tax of both CGST and SGST and landing that goods with tax to the destination state. And the second challenge that was before implementation of goods and services tax was constitutional. Because as all of you know that in our constitution, the taxation power in specifically in goods and services up to manufacturing level was with the union government. And beyond manufacturing, it was with the state government. So goods and services tax give us, say, institutes a tax system where concurrent taxation power prevails between the union and state government, right from the manufacturing to consumption. It is the equal, or I could say, the concurrent taxation power between the union and state government. And this was a challenge. And if you go through all the tax reforms that we had, they never thought that India could achieve this constitutional amendment that has happened through 101st constitutional amendment and that implemented, that actually facilitated implementation of goods and services tax. And then another minor problem was there, or challenge was there, is the definitional differences between goods and services. So if it is not good in the GST system, it is the services. So as we go along with my today's talk, I will discuss some of these issues. But please be aware that actually Indian taxation system was destination-based system before introduction of central sales tax in 1957. So 1957, we introduced the central sales tax, and that made the Indian tax system origin-based. And origin-based means that the tax, when the goods move from one state to another state, it not only the goods move, it takes the tax along with it and lands in the destination state. And in the destination, they used to attack the anti-tax. And if anti-tax was not, even the input tax credit was not allowed against the anti-tax, then it was a cascading kind of tax. So in the tax reforms of indirect taxes, if we go through the history of that thing, or I could say sequence of tax reforms. So in the VAT system, I could say the modern VAT system introduced in Indian tax system in 1986 with the modified value-added tax system. But before modified VAT system, there was a system of pro forma credit that used to give the credit on sales against purchases, but that was not a modern input tax credit system. So I could say that 1986 was the landmark year, and that introduced the mod VAT system. Apart from that, mod VAT system had lots of problems, as you can see that what are the problems and challenges, mainly in the tax reform committee that headed by Professor Chellaiah. And Chellaiah committee gave a specific recommendation how to reform this modified value-added tax system. And that's why, with the introduction of the services tax in 94-95, and taking cue from this modified and the recommendation of the tax reforms, we had a much cleaner tax system that is called VAT system in that introduced in around 2001 that time. So, but I also like to mention that the service tax came in 94-95 as a standalone tax on services. And there was no input tax credit either for the purchases of the VAT or VAT, or even for the services because services, when they are supplied, they purchase goods as well as services to provide the service. But there is no system of input tax credit in the when services tax introduced. So first concept of input tax credit introduced in services in 2002-3 after recommendation of the Calcutta Tax Force. And it was comprehensive input tax credit in 2003-4. Then it is merged with the SENVAT credit and service tax credit mutually adjustable in 2004-5. So this made the entire central tax system. The central tax system, we had the union excise duty, that is SENVAT. Then the other two part, basically the customs part, mainly the countervailing duty and special additional duty, and the service tax. There was the central input tax credit system against the CBD, but SAD part, that was the equivalent to our state taxes, was standalone tax. So read some of the study material that is shared with you. As you know that we have time constant to explain everything. And on the state tax system, I could say that state tax system was a very complex system before introduction of value-added tax system. Unless we discuss the sales tax system, sales tax system was before the value-added tax system that introduced in 2003 in Haryana and for most other states from 2005 was a, I could say that the is quite kind of difficult tax system to administer or comply with. So there's no harmonization of sales tax rates across states. There's no the harmonization of rules and regulations or the administrative measures, and there's always cascading of tax. But with that, we got, after that, we got the value-added tax system. And value-added tax system, please here also the role of this tax reform committee, and specifically the report or the study on reforms in domestic state taxes by Amoris Bakshi and others, played an important role in the introduction of value-added taxes. So value-added tax system helped us to get a harmonized design and structure of state VAT system with a floor rate of 12.5%, and the deviation from the 12.5% to higher rate happened much later part of the after the introduction of value-added tax system. And also it reduces the cascading of taxes. And the major achievement we got through this value-added tax system got the institution that Empowered Committee of State Finance Ministers. And please remember, this Empowered Committee of State Finance Minister played an important role also in introduction of goods and services tax. But what are the challenges of the VAT system? Because VAT system was not integrated with other central tax system like the SENVAT, because manufacturing was being the first point sales. So when the goods are coming out from the factory gate, they used to first attract the SENVAT, and on top of the SENVAT paid price, there was a sales tax and then VAT. Because sales tax was replaced by the value-added tax system, so VAT is levied on SENVAT paid price of the manufacturing goods. Then when it comes to retail or wholesale trade, then input tax credit against the VAT was adjustable if the purchases were intrastate. But if the purchases, suppose you are purchasing some goods or inputs from other state, there is no mechanism of providing input tax credit. So CST was cascading, and entry tax, some states, the entry tax was a pure octroi kind of tax, local body kind of tax, and there's no provision of input tax credit. So the price, then central sales tax, plus entry tax used to cost. Then there is a so there is a need for introduction of GST. So what GST gave us, it first gave the definition of goods and or services, I could say, that everything, the goods and services, if it is not a good, it is a service. So there is no definitional differences, I would say, between the goods and services. And there is no definitional differences between production and distribution. So it facilitates, this 101st Amendment facilitates the concurrent taxation power between the union and state government, and also it gives a concurrent administration power also for goods and services. So that is the major achievement of goods and services tax. And the other kind of achievement that we have, that in case of consignment transfer in interstate sales, there's no provision for central sales tax. So central sales tax had a three kind of structure, three rate structure, I could say. If it is a B2C, then there will be one kind of tax, that the tax equivalent into the origin state. Suppose 13.5% is the state VAT that will be levied. Suppose in that era, you used to purchase something over e-commerce like site, before introduction of GST, if you see, if you have kept the bill, if you see that you have paid 13.5% or 12.5% state VAT when the purchases you have made over the online or this e-commerce site. Again, if it is a business to business consumption, the transfer or the transaction, then the equivalent CST rate was 2%. But if it is a consignment transfer, then there is no CST. Please remember that CST still prevails even in the GST regime for goods which are not yet attracting GST, like petrol, diesel, ATF, then crude petroleum, then natural gas and alcoholic beverages. If those goods are moving from one state to another state, they attract only 2% CST rather than IGST, that is, other goods are attracted. Please remember that this transaction before the 2 years back made a huge revenue loss for the state government. But the Finance Act of 223, I think so, made this thing that if this transfer is only for manufacturing, then this special CST rate is applicable, otherwise not. So the basic features of the GST, as all you know, that GST is a comprehensive value-added tax encompassing both goods and services with concurrent taxation power between the union and state government. This is the definition of goods and services tax. It gives a common market, because earlier, before the introduction of GST, suppose if you have to do the business across all the states, then what will happen? Then you have to comply with around 29 rules and regulations, and you have to meet 29 kind of set of tax filing kind of thing, I could say. Suppose you are sending some goods to other states, then you have to know what is the rules and regulations. Suppose if you have a business in Delhi and you want to send the goods to other states, then either you can sell it in CST or you have to have a branch transfer, consignment transfer, that actually increase the cost of doing business or transaction cost. And apart from that, suppose if you have to do a all India business, then you have to, first thing that you have to file the return, tax return. Then you have to know the rules and regulation of the state. And tax return was not very easy before the GST, because some state it was online, some state it was both online and paper, some state it was paper kind of thing. So IT harmonization, this that happened through introduction of GST to the GSTN as a unique kind of thing. So that is another achievement of institution. And another institution that we got is GST Council, which I could say is a transformed kind of institution from Import Committee of Finance Ministers that is transformed to, but still the Import Committee of Finance Minister, that institution still remains. But GST Council have a border perspective and role in the GST implementation and that thing. But of course, there are issues related to GST compliance, because as you know that GST, every month you have to file 2 tax returns, the GSTR 1 and please.
I'm sorry, Professor Mukherjee, you might want to move on a little bit because of the time.
Yes,
So,
yes.
Because we do have one more speaker.
Yes. So I'll mostly touch upon the challenges that we have. So one kind of challenges we have is basically the multiple rate structure of Indian GST. We have, you see that there's a large number of tax rates. So we need to prune down this tax rate, maximum 3 rates or 2 rates kind of thing. But there's always a basically the challenge that if the tax rate is low, the number is low, then it could be regressive as compared to progressivity that we want to institute or input in the GST system. Then there is a challenge that after the GST compensation is over, how to protect the GST revenue of the state government. So that is another challenge, because as one of the papers that I have shown, the none of the states could achieve that what has subsumed into GST before introduction of GST, the equivalent revenue after the introduction of GST. So to protect these states, we need to have a system, and that kind of challenge that we have. Then another kind of the challenge that we'll have in that, I'll say that the tax evasion, because the GST is a self-policing kind of tax, but there I will not be part of the GST if my input tax credit claim is not very high. So that kind of challenge we have. So I have pointed out, and there are always a task versus power approach in GST administration. And I could say that GST compliance is improving after the COVID. And there are lots of structural shortcomings. One is multiple rate structure, and the another thing is the price-based tax setting approach. Because if it is price is 1,000 rupees, say footwear, then the 5% tax rate, if it is higher than 1,000 rupees, it's around 18% tax kind of thing. So these are the other challenges we have. Basically, whether we need the harmonized GST rate structure, because that I think is not important for continuation of GST system. And the last thing is that I want to mention that how to improve the cooperation in tax administration between the union and state. So with that, I want to stop, because maybe that I may not have much time on that. And thank you for your patience. If you have any question, I'd be happy to answer.
Thank you very much. You have given a very good history of the indirect taxation reforms. and some of the challenges of GST. Anybody has any question? We can take one or two. Okay. I think one suggestion I would have, it would have been useful to have the number of GST taxpayers before and after reform, that is pre-GST, post-GST, how it is behaving, and where is GST originating? So how do we broad base GST revenue generation across states, some states, and what we need to do on that. But that is a top, I realize the time constraint. Thank you very much. Anybody else has any comment? Otherwise, we go to our third speaker for the day.
So we have a few questions in the questions.
There's a question, I think. There's a question by Sanjay Agarwal.
Sure, Sanjay, go ahead.
How many states are in laws compared to earlier regime? So I mentioned that I will not say it's the laws. Basically, the GST revenue compensation protected the revenue of the states. And with GST compensation, most of the states would meet that what the revenue has subsumed into GST, except two states mostly that and one or two states, mainly Madhya Pradesh that I found is one state. Even GST compensation, they are not able to cope up with what was subsumed in before in the revenue subsumed into GST. On Professor Asad, the second question that the second observation that basically I think you want to say that how GST originated into state or basically you want to say that how GST is helping the state or what are the challenges there in the individual states?
No, what I meant was that we have got a GST collection that is published every month, right? And which state does it originate? So is Maharashtra, what proportion Maharashtra contributes, Kerala contributes, West Bengal contributes, and so on. And dynamically, if you have a, how it is changing so that we can spread the revenue generation from GST to more states and get them to grow. So that would be very useful for the fiscal system.
But
that's what I.
Thank you. So I'll try to address that. But there's a challenges I don't want to spend much time. But only one thing that I want to mention. The monthly collection data that you see through the GSTN platform, GST has a problem because that's a dynamic data because they follow the accrual accounting. Where the GST revenue from the Department of Revenue follow the cash accounting system. So there's a problem. So that's why I don't.
Okay. That's fine. That's fine. It's just an observation. But thank you very much. Thank you very much. There was a lot of learning in your presentation. Maybe now move on to Aashish Chandorkar, his presentation. Aashish, good to see you. We have been in correspondence for many years. First time we are meeting, and that too online. So welcome. And
yes, Professor Ashish, thank you so much for inviting me. Let me just share my presentation.
Meanwhile, Tripta, you can introduce it.
Sure, sir. So next, I would like to invite Dr. Aashish Chandorkar, Counselor, Permanent Mission of India to the World Trade Organization in Geneva, Government of India to discuss evolving global trade architecture and return of industrial policy. Over to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tripta. And thank you, IMPRI and Professor Asher for calling me for this session. Just to clarify 2 points. First, I mean, I'm not a doctor. I never had the patience to study medicine, and I don't think I have the qualifications to do a PhD. So I don't know where that error crept from. So the doctor prefix is not really correct. And secondly, I mean, I work for the government of India. So I speak here in my personal capacity. All views are my own, and they don't reflect the government position on these topics. So my screen is visible, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So just to give you a sense of the topic today, what I thought was I'll speak about the intersection of industrial policy and trade policy. This topic is getting prominence, or it's receiving a lot of interest in the last, let's say, 2 or 3 years, and especially in the post-pandemic world. And the kind of actions which the governments are taking around the world has attracted a lot of criticism, a lot of commentary on how the idea of global trade or free trade is being challenged, or if not dismantled, or at least it is being challenged through the actions of the governments. And so there's the more purist type of economists have been criticizing the interventions of the governments, not just in India, but around the world, actually, on some of these things. So I just thought that since this topic is very much in vogue, and perhaps we also hear about Indian policies like the production-linked incentives and so on, I thought it would be good to really do a little bit of a deep dive into how did we reach here in the first place, and how what is the relationship or the link between industrial and trade policies, what's going on globally, and then come back to the Indian policies to see if that is any different, or are we entitled to do what we are doing, etc. So those questions can be then asked in the light of what has happened in the past. I will, of course, share the deck with the IMPRI organizers, so they can circulate the presentation if they so wish. Yeah. So let's go back to a little bit for about 50 odd years in history, and when especially when the Thatcher Reagan consensus became the linchpin of the global economic discourse, we heard about how the government intervention itself became a bit of a taboo in the policies, in the economic policies. And what we see today, I mean, the global architecture that we see today in terms of trade is essentially through a series of events which took place post Second World War, but certainly they gained prominence after the establishment of WTO. But let us just revisit how these events, how the events of globalization impacted the way the global trade architecture has evolved. So firstly, what we should remember is that the multilateral rules-based order, what we see today, and that's not just about trade, but I think more broadly, the financial architecture, is actually a byproduct of globalization. So post-World War II, we had the formation of the United Nations in its current form. We had the IMF and the World Bank come up. And we also had the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was GATT. Just to give you a bit of a background, in fact, it was not supposed to be just IMF and World Bank, but there was a third organization which was supposed to be formed, which was called the International Trade Organization, ITO. But that the negotiations towards an ITO got stuck actually mostly by the US actually at that point of time, because US did not want elements like labor policies to come in, which is kind of ironic because today they push for it and other countries oppose, like we oppose today, the intersection of trade and labor. But at that time, US actually opposed this, and they said that this will not pass through their Senate, etc. And then actually the ITO negotiations kind of stalled because of that objection. And some countries, 23 countries went ahead and formed a temporary organization or temporary system, which was called the GATT. This was supposed to go away when ITO was formed, but that really never happened. So GATT became pretty much a permanent structure. Of course, GATT also kept evolving over the years, but GATT came into picture in 1948. Then at the end of the trailing end of the Cold War, the negotiations for, the ITO negotiations were restarted in 1986, which were termed as the Uruguay round negotiations. And that led to the formation of the WTO in 1995. WTO came into picture on 1st of January 1995. WTO grandfathered everything that was in GATT. It created some specific clarifications or deviations or some enabling clauses around those policies, around those rules. But it also added a lot of other rules. So WTO was a single undertaking. There were several agreements. It was not just the GATT of 1947, but a whole bunch of new agreements around import licensing and technical barriers to trade and government procurement, something called sanitary and phytosanitary measures, anti-dumping, subsidies, countervailing measures. Whole bunch of agreements got signed as a single undertaking. So basically all participants had to agree to all or none. And WTO also expanded beyond goods to include services trade and the TRIPS, or the intellectual property agreement, as well. So it was a fairly broad-based kind of an agreement. And then, of course, since then, we have had the Bank Fund Consensus, especially it became stronger after the Latin American and Asian crashes in the 80s and 90s. So what we see today, the way, the rules of macroeconomics or the rules of global trade, what we see today is actually a culmination of this long process. But what needs to be understood is that every significant step of that process happened at the peak of globalization. So, and this is not a coincidence. This is actually a very much a design feature of what we experience today. That these organizations or these rules were formed at the peak of optimism, at the peak of, say, the Western power controlling the global narrative or shaping the global narrative. So, in fact, some of you may remember this phrase called the end of history. It was a very famous book which came out, post the Soviet collapse. So there was this larger Western thought that now the world will move towards a very standardized form of liberal democracy with open borders, etc. And but of course, we know that since then the idea has been challenged several times through the internet crash, then the global financial crisis, and then of course through the pandemic. But these rules were designed for an ideal world which could be borderless or which could be frictionless, which would converge towards certain set of values and certain set of behaviors. So in that sense, the question then arises that whether trade is a byproduct of globalization or a driver of globalization. And the commentary which you see today leans towards the latter. A lot of the economists these days almost treat the WTO law as a canonical law. That, well, it is enshrined into legality, and that is pretty much it. Nothing exists beyond that. This is like the end all of all trade conversations, and you should keep moving towards progressive liberalization of these rules and progressive dismantling of border controls, etc., etc. So there have been some very specific positions which have emerged out of this kind of a consensus, which is that tariffs are bad, subsidies are bad, the standards or regulations for quality, they could be good or bad. It depends on why they are being erected for. But this kind of a consensus exists in today's trade commentary. I mean, if you see the commentary both on the economic side and the legal side, I mean, one important thing to keep here in mind is that unlike any other international agreement, WTO is actually a legal agreement where the sovereign members of WTO, or in some cases not sovereign members but customs unions who are part of WTO, have agreed to give this a legal character, because any issues which arise from the let's say perceived or real non-compliance of the WTO agreements can be challenged inside WTO itself through a dispute settlement mechanism. So in that sense, the stronger or let's say on one side you will have a view that this is almost like a natural law or a canonical law in itself, where countries, even if that means you cede your sovereignty, so be it, because we have agreed to an international law which is kind of cast in stone. And hence the industrial policy is bad. We should all be looking at open borders and flow of goods and services, etc., etc. So that's been like the prevalent discourse globally in the last 50 odd years, just for the stage setting. Now let's look at what is industrial policy. So industrial policy would broadly refer to government efforts to shape the economy in terms of creating specific targeted interventions. This could be done for social purposes. It could be done for transformation of specific sectors, or to create national champions. And it is achieved through a range of tools like subsidies or tax incentives or regulations, etc. So in today's prevalent commentary, you will see that governments investing in industrial policy is considered bad. Governments investing on soft infrastructure, which is human capital, education, healthcare, that is considered good. And the idea is that the government should stay as much away from the industrial policy or shaping the economic actors, either influencing them directly or incentivizing them to behave in a certain way. That is not considered, let's say, attractive or acceptable. However, what we are seeing, what we see today, wasn't really the case historically. I mean, if you go back, and again, I want to do some, the idea here is to explain how we have ended up here, so that you have a full view, the participants have a full view of the fact that the world was not always like this. And all of these rules, because they got created at a certain point in time, specifically when the globalization was at its peak, it kind of masks the history behind how these rules evolved over the years or over a period of time. So actually, funnily enough, the champions of today's free trade or borderless worlds or more openness were actually the biggest protectionist actors in the past history, before the GATT was formed. And I mean, of course, the global history of colonialism is actually a history of trade as well, right? I think most of us appreciate that what happened in Asia, Africa, Latin America was almost entirely driven by trade for the first few hundreds of the colonial history. And then, of course, it became a more political kind of an ambition in terms of having empires, global empires. But trade really was the backbone of all colonial history for almost 4 to 5 centuries around the world. Then when US became independent, and of course, US is considered one of the economies where the government has always tried to not meddle. But actually, the first major policy which the first US government designed was something called a Report on Manufacturers, which came out in 1791, authored by Alexander Hamilton, one of the founding fathers, and perhaps considered one of the most important economic figures in the history of the US. And this report actually advocated for helping the US businesses grow, or helping the US industries grow in a certain way, whatever was relevant for that point of time. So it was a very active kind of a intervention on industrial policy. Going further east in the UK, there was the idea of Corn Laws, where the lords or the elites of the society, when they kind of captured agriculture, so they had this idea that you should only eat what is produced in the UK. So they would impose tariffs on importing cheap grains from around the world, and essentially help increase the price of the products which were being grown in the UK, which favored a certain part of the society. So again, tariffs were used, mercantilism was used in a very active way in the UK as late as 1850s. In Germany, further east, some of you must have heard of this economist called Friedrich List, who was heavily influenced by the ideas of Alexander Hamilton. And actually, it was through his influence that a lot of investment happened in Europe in terms of railroads, in terms of connectivity, infrastructure, human capital, universities. The importance of education and economy, the interlinkages between education and economy were understood through the influence of Friedrich List's work. Further east in Japan, of course, you must have heard of Meiji Restoration between 1850s and the First World War, where the Meiji Empire basically, I mean, they use the same ideas, these ideas which are listed above in that slide, to help create a very self-sufficient Japanese economy, a very strong Japanese economy pre-World War I. And then, of course, between the two wars, US also had the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which was, again, a very, very, very active interventionist policy, having high tariffs on import and protecting the local industry. So, right for about 500 years, there was a very, very active industrial policy around the world until the GATT came into picture. And at the time when some of these countries became much more prominent in terms of their own economic strengths, they decided that tariffs were actually bad, and no one else should be using them. And that's how the genesis of that's how the conversation started to change or completely turn on its head post the Second World War. Now, even after the Second World War, if you see what happened in other countries, so if you take the example of South Korea, perhaps the most visible example of how industrial policy can transform a society from a poor society into a developed economy. So in Korea, I mean, to the works of General Park Chung-hee, who ruled the country for several years, he was in favor of creating national champions. National champions were companies which would work with the government very actively towards attaining common objectives. So you had a national government objective, and then you had the profit motive of the companies. How do you bring them together? So Korea used targeted tariffs to protect a barrier for entry, or created protection for the local industry, which then became a very export-oriented industry, especially in the areas of iron and steel, shipbuilding, cars, whole bunch of other activities. Now, this is not to say that tariffs were infinitely high. Korea did a very interesting job of creating moderate tariffs, and they would also stop support for companies which were not able to compete globally. So their approach was very clear. This was the same in Japan also, by the way, which is to say that the companies which couldn't compete would then not get the government support. So this was not about having infinite subsidies or just having subsidies for the sake of it. They promoted a very active benchmarking of companies against global competition, not just about local competition. So the same played out in Japan, where the idea of national exceptionalism was very, very deeply ingrained in the policy making. The MITI, which is the Ministry of Trade and Industry in Japan, even to date, I mean, they remain extremely powerful in terms of how their voice is heard inside the government. They really shaped how the credit was directed, what kind of financial policies were created, and so on. And these policies are roughly known as dirigistic policies or policies with government active interventions. Then in Southeast Asia, the same playbook took place in Malaysia and Indonesia, and most notably in Vietnam, which has become an export powerhouse. Some countries tried and failed. For example, Philippines couldn't adopt to these policies very well. Even Malaysia, to some extent, trailed off. But in Taiwan, in Indonesia, the same playbook kept repeating, where they learned from Japan and Korea, who had learned from Germany, who had learned from US and UK. And of course, 2001 onwards, we know that China completely dominates the global trade. China was not a founding member of WTO in 1995. They joined in 2001. And post that, of course, they've blazed a trail of economic growth, and which has been export-led. So why is this important to understand? Is because that the concepts that you hear today, and again, not to kind of argue that those concepts are incorrect, but the point is that those concepts were not arrived at overnight. There's a whole history of saying that a very interventionist government policy was the norm and not the exception. It has only become exception post WTO came into picture, and even then, perhaps more prominently in the last 20-25 years, actually. Now, what has happened is that this consensus that governments should not intervene actively with the industry, which is like the consensus of the last 20-30 years, that is now being challenged, and it is being challenged in multiple ways. So firstly, we have had a polycrisis. We have seen the combination of pandemic, the Ukraine conflict. We have seen issues around what happens when the world closes down partly or wholly? There's been a crisis of balance of payment for several countries. I think more than 50 odd countries are in a bad economic shape today. Several of them are knocking the doors of IMF for support. There has been a debt-fueled growth, which has come to a complete crashing halt in the last, let's say, few years. So this polycrisis is now leading countries to rethink this link between industry and trade. And of course, the link is that if you remain reliant only on imports, if you have open borders, no tariffs, full dependence on import, then how do you fund them basically, right? Like where do you get the foreign exchange to fund those uncontrolled level of imports? The second debate is about resilience versus efficiency. So our supply chains have always been in the modern era led by technology. Since the internet boom, our supply chains have always been wired for just-in-time efficiency. But that came into deep question when China shut down during the pandemic, or when Southeast Asia shut down, and to a lesser extent when India shut down. Because how do you keep manufacturing things and then still not, I mean, if you don't have any inventory, if you don't have any resilience in your system, so how do you kind of stay afloat? I mean, how do your operations become continuous? So this issue around supply chain resiliency rather than supply chain efficiency is now being asked more and more. Typically, we talk about supply chain resilience in three characteristics, which is trust, timeliness, and transparency. So that has been that has come up in the last few years. We have also seen the limits of interconnectedness. So this is important to know. I mean, what happens is that when trade becomes the central point of discussion, then open borders lead to other types of behaviors as well. And for example, the famous economist Dani Rodrik, who's a Turkish origin economist but in the US, he has coined a famous trilemma, which says that you can only have national sovereignty, democracy, and open trade. Only two of these three. You can't have all three. No country can have all three. And what the trilemma means is that if you have a limitless open trade, that would obviously there'll be calls for more open movement of ideas, people, culture, all of that, right? So the social part then starts getting integrated also around the world, and not just the economic part, which then leads to a loss of sovereignty for a country, because then you cannot take decisions with that much of freedom, given that you have to look at the international implication of those decisions. Similarly, if you want to retain your sovereignty and still have trade, then you'll have to curb the freedom given to your population in terms of freedom of speech or freedom of ability to interact with other people outside your country and so on. Or of course, you can have sovereignty and democracy in your own country, a model which you follow internally, but then you can't have limitless open borders. You have to keep some control. So this kind of a limits of interconnectedness has been propounded in the last, let's say, 15 years or so, led largely by Dani Rodrik actually, but now several more people are talking about it as to how much do you interconnect. We also saw the challenge of weaponization of everything, right? So through the conflict, we are seeing that a financial system can be weaponized, food grains can be weaponized. I mean, food security then becomes a challenge. So, for example, if you were dependent completely on importing food grains, what happens when the food grains are not available, right? And which also means that someone can put, like if I was an exporter and a country was an importer, I can actually pressurize that country by stopping my exports, right? So then I can weaponize that as a power, which goes beyond the question of food security. It then becomes a geopolitical question. So this has been an issue of weaponization of everything, especially for food security. This is one of the critical emerging issues of our times. And of course, healthcare security. We saw this during the pandemic, that there was a whole wave of nationalism for vaccines. Who should get vaccines first? If I have made a vaccine, will I share the technology with someone else? The profit motive of the vaccine makers. If your cost of, let's say, making vaccine was 50 cents, should you sell it at $20 per dose? So those questions basically came into picture in a big way. And the poorer countries or countries which had no scientific or geopolitical heft saw themselves standing at the back of the queue. They were struggling to get vaccines. And by the way, that also included even larger countries, right? And relatively richer countries. So for example, you must have heard stories about, say, Canada or Brazil. I mean, even those countries of that economic heft also struggled to get vaccines on time because they did not have any technology to make them locally, either through their own sources, or no one was, of course, giving technology away in those times for someone else to manufacture vaccines as an open source, etc. So I think these issues have had a deep imprint on the way global trade is now thought about. And what has happened is, because of these crises, there has been an emergence of, or not, I shouldn't say emergence, I should say a resurgence, or in a big way, of industrial policy around the world. We see that the governments are now trying to address this in a big way. And I'll give you several examples of this. So the rationale that how West is not justifying this, because West was a champion of open borders, free trade, no intervention, no industrial policy. So now they are talking more and more about national security. They're talking about human health, environment health, plant health. I mean, agriculture, there should not be any damage to agriculture, basically. They're talking about the importance of intellectual property protection, because they suddenly realize that by giving away technology and by outsourcing only manufacturing, that design which goes from your country to some other country can actually be pried upon. That technology can be localized or studied or learned, and then suddenly you have a cheaper knockoff which comes into play. So intellectual property protection has become a big issue. There have been issues of local jobs. As inflation has surged in the last 3-4 years, these countries are under tremendous pressure to have social, let's say, security or social cohesion maintained. And how do you create jobs basically in your own economy? Then there are objectives of supply chain control. So just to give you a kind of an example of how severe the crisis was, I joined this role with the government. I mean, I'm a lateral entrant to the government, so I'm doing a 3-year role. I came here to Switzerland in September 2021, and that there was a second wave of COVID then, soon after. And even in a country like Switzerland, which is a hub of pharma research, etc., and a deep kind of a location for practically all a lot of great pharma intellectual property, Switzerland had no ability to manufacture masks and even stuff like sanitizers, because they just dependent or PPE kits. So what I realized after coming here was that almost all of it was imported. And basically, when you import masks, I mean, I have bought like a 30-piece mask for 20 CHF, 25 CHF, right? So 80 rupees per mask, which in India I think was selling at 5 rupees, 7 rupees, right? Or so I think that is a type of difference which these economies saw. And of course, it's not just the price; it's the fact that you may run out of masks and someone else may not give it to you, right? So healthcare security became supply chain control became like a big driver of the new industrial policy which we see today. And then, of course, there are social objectives and the fact like you have to control the future, AI, etc. So you want to control the technologies of the future, critical minerals, all of that. And how has that industrial policy now manifested itself? What are we seeing around us? So we are seeing subsidies like grants, research, new technology investments. We see refunds or rebates or exemptions on taxes. We see investments in labor quality and quantity support. So, for example, the government's giving incentives to hire, providing incentives to firms to hire, or investment in skills, for example. The government's also trying to facilitate technology transfer, so from one sector to another sector, or from public sector to private sector. So a very interventionist role in terms of technology transfer. And then, of course, there's this idea of plug-and-play infrastructure, right? So when you want to create an industry cluster, you provide the industry with land, water, power, energy, everything. And you basically expect them to just come and set up a factory. In some cases, for example, in the services industry, you can even create the buildings, because you can even outfit the buildings, because largely the configuration is fairly standardized. So you can provide any kind of a plug-and-play infrastructure depending on what kind of industry cluster you want to develop or what you're targeting for investments. And some practical examples of this. So I've just taken 3 countries, but this is happening everywhere. 3 geographies I have taken. In the US, you must have heard of the acts like Build Back Better Act, or the Inflation Reduction Act, or the CHIPS Act, which the CHIPS Act targeted largely semiconductors and electronics manufacturing, the localization of that. Then there are also, US also actually uses, I forgot to mention, they also use export controls in a big way, that they are trying to see that they have an export control regime so that the technology doesn't go to other countries, especially targeting China in a big way. And they've also teamed up with other partners like Japan and Netherlands, so that the semiconductor know-how and the emerging semiconductor, let's say, control is retained by within the US or with the US allies. Then you have in Japan, there are subsidies for localization. So Japan is actually giving money to companies who want to set up factories back in Japan coming out of China. So this is specifically targeted towards companies which have got facilities in China. Then there's something called Green Transformation Initiative, for which Japan has earmarked a lot of money. There's also a focus on domestic chip manufacturing in Japan. If we come to the EU, EU actually is like, has got the highest concentration of interventionist measures. There's something called the EU Green Deal. The thing about EU is that, unlike in US and Japan, where the objectives are fairly bluntly stated, which is that we don't want this to go out anymore, we will do it ourselves. We want to have jobs and supply chain control inside US, so or in Japan. So they are, let's say, fairly blunt about it. The EU approach is very different. EU is not saying that free trade is bad. What EU is saying is that environment is also important, or labor rights are also important, or human rights are also important. I mean, all kinds of things which are not related to the central argument of running industries. And they are creating funds or initiatives to justify that we need to have improvements on these other parameters, and which is where we will do this work ourselves, because we can do it better on these other counts. By enacting some law, I can protect environment. By enacting some law, I can promote the use of green energy, that kind of stuff. So the EU reasoning, so for example, if you read the Inflation Reduction Act versus the EU Green Deal documents, the Inflation Reduction Act would essentially target, have a lot of detail about the measure, but the EU's documents will have a lot of inputs on the background of it, as to why are we doing this, what studies did we commission, what did these studies find out, why can't you do this, why do I have to intervene, why do I have to spend my own money, all that kind of stuff. So EU takes a very, let's say, very academic route towards this question, and tries to hide its real objective, the real protectionist objectives, through a message of goodness, which is around protection of environment or labor rights and so on. So each of these areas, if you search and if you Google for them, you will find like a whole bunch of things coming from EU, and they basically support their own EU members through money, but they want to penalize others and impose barriers for others to send goods into EU. Just to give you a few examples, actually, the trade policies I have listed are actually all EU trade policies right now, although other countries also starting to adopt similar policies. But just to give you a brief overview of what is happening, how industrial policy is now impacting trade policy, but in a negative way this time. So carbon border adjustments. EU has enacted a legislation called Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM. What it says is that if you make steel, or there are a few products covered, 5-6 sectors covered in it currently. There could be more sectors later. So they are saying that if you produce something in this sector like steel or aluminium or fertilizers, and if your emission is X, and my emission is Y, and on X, you have not paid any carbon tax, because in your country, you may not have a carbon tax directly. Not tax, sorry, a carbon price. Like if you may not have a carbon market in your country. For example, India doesn't have a carbon market yet, although we have a legislation in place now as of November 2022, but we don't have a functioning market today. So let's say if your carbon price paid is 0, or in China it could be 10 euros, or in Korea it could be 8 euros or whatever. But my carbon price, because in EU there's a very active carbon market, it's a cap and trade market, so they cap the total emissions which are allowed, and then let the certificates be traded. So whoever needs it more urgently can buy those certificates and essentially emit that much carbon. So, if the EU price is 90 euros and your price is 0 or 5 or 10, then you have to pay an additional adjustment of 90 minus 0, 5 or 10 when you send this steel or aluminum or fertilizers to EU. So this essentially it's like a new kind of a tariff, but it's like a carbon tariff which they have imposed. So this is already live. This law will come into full force in 2025. But the reporting, so for example, starting 1st October, if India has to send steel to EU, a lot of data has to be shared by the exporter on what kind of steel is, what kind of emissions are embedded in that steel, basically. So this is one interventionist measure which is going to disrupt the global trade in certain sectors. Starting very, very soon, you will hear more about this starting next month. This will become much more mainstream outside of the trade community once it starts hitting industries. There's something called deforestation-free supply chains. So this is, again, EU has enacted this rule, but others like UK, US also either contemplating or they are already working towards this. So they are saying that if you want to send something to my country, for example, if you want to send coffee or cocoa or palm oil, then you cannot be cutting forests. And if you cut forests, then I will not accept your produce. Now, how do you determine whether the forest was cut or not? So there are complex regulations behind this to determine whether deforestation occurred or not, or did not occur. So again, it is like applying your trade objective or your, let's say, industrial objective or your economic or social objective in a way that it is harmful or it impinges on my sovereignty. Essentially, it's like a unilateral rule making which is being done to improve someone else's climate objective or in this case, biodiversity objective or deforestation objective. Then there are rules around waste management, packaging design, where EU is saying that they will not send you scrap for processing if you don't treat it the way OECD countries treat it. Or they will, when you send something to EU, then the packaging has to be in a certain way. You cannot use more than X quantity of plastic, or the ratio of the product and the plastic has to be adjusted in some way. The ratio of the cardboard boxes has to be adjusted in a certain way. So all kinds of regulations are being designed. And then finally, they are looking at circular economy regulations, which are known as eco-design regulations. So they are saying that to promote circular economy, every stage of supply chain has to be circular in itself. So to give you an example, let's say EU uses and throws a lot of clothes, ready-made garments, right? RMG, which is one of the biggest area of global trade and a biggest source of foreign exchange for almost all developing countries. So EU is saying that now you have to declare how much water have you used to produce this RMG. What kind of yarn was there? Did you recycle the yarn? And did you get the yarn through recycling of old cloths in any clothes in any way? What power was used, whether it was renewable or not? So they are creating this design requirements that even before you send the product to me, you need to label, your labeling should have all kinds of this information. And of course, these type of data points are very difficult to gather for developing countries, and especially even developing countries, some of them can adjust to it. Like China or India may still be able to do something about this, but like more poorer countries will find it difficult to gather this kind of a data. Most of these businesses are small businesses. But again, in this case, EU is not enacting its own industrial policy. They are basically creating non-tariff barriers for other trade partners in a big way. Now, what will be the implication? The implication will be that, of course, the EU manufacturers will be able to do this. For example, if let's say I create a factory, EU has much more technology for recycling, for circular economy. So eventually this production will get localized within the EU territories. It could help industrialize some of the Eastern European countries in some ways. In fact, Poland has already been a big beneficiary of some of these initiatives, where a lot of industry is coming back into Poland, which is relatively cheap in a euro sense, but of course it is not as cheap as what the cost would be in Asia or in Africa or in Latin America. So I think these are very deeply interventionist policies which are being applied directly to trade as well, by the way. It is not just to... So EU's combination is that I will incentivize on one hand, and I will penalize others on the other hand. And this mechanism will continue to grow beyond EU also in the coming years, the way other governments are thinking about it. Now, with this background, coming to the last part of my discussion was that we hear a lot of criticism about our policies. We hear about the good, whether PLI is good, whether PLI is bad, whether it is attaining its objectives. Now, with all this background of what has happened for the last 500 years in the global economy, what is happening today in the global economy, with this, when you think about our policies or our way of thinking, you will realize that actually we should cut much more slack to ourselves than we usually do. In terms of, oh, PLI lagaya, but kuch hua nahi, like nothing has happened in the last 3 months. Well, I mean, these things don't happen in 3 months or 6 months, right? Like the localization or the incremental movement of supply chain from one country to another country will happen over years. It will not happen over, let's say, 3 months or 6 months. So, which is why the production-linked incentives are designed for 6-7 years or even 10 years from today. I mean, if you see some of them go up to 2030, 2031 as well. And the results will come with some lag. So we have to be patient with what we are doing. Of course, as you know, this has worked very well in the area of mobile phones. Perhaps we are catching up a little bit on telecom equipment also, maybe in other sectors also. Pharma also, we have been able to localize some active pharma ingredients. I know some of the attendees come from that background, from the pharma side. So they would know that India is now making much more APIs inside India rather than being dependent on them. So that is one part. Then there is, I talked about the resilient supply chains. So, if you see PM Modi's statements, he has spoken about trust, transparency, and timeliness. So he has defined resilient supply chains not as an abstract idea, but he's saying that the partners should be trusted. They should be able to service the requirements of supply chains, because supply chains are integrated. Components can move multiple times around the world before they become a finished product. So timeliness is important. And there should be transparency, which is to say that if I cannot do something, I should be able to say that I'm not going to do this. This is what the plan B is, etc., which was missing at the time of pandemic, because most countries figure out that there is no plan B. Like either you get something or you don't get something. So that became a major issue, which was a big driver of inflation. Then, which is why we talk about manufacturing strength. We talk about why it is important for India. And again, when we say self-sufficiency, Atmanirbhar, that doesn't mean that you make everything. What it means is that you need to have control over your requirements. So, for example, we are also incentivizing foreign firms to come manufacture in India. We have not taken an approach that, okay, we will only support Indian companies, or all foreign goods are bad and only Indian goods will be used. No, our capital is also foreign in many cases, right? I mean, we are one of the biggest. In fact, our FDI has been at a very high level in the last 3-4 years. So we are promoting the flow of capital. We are promoting the flow of know-how, technology, new investments in India. But we are saying do it in India. And let it not stay outside the borders, irrespective of who makes it, right? So it is not that only the Indian companies should make something. You must have also heard about India's quality control orders, or QCOs. This is a term which those in manufacturing or trade side would have heard a lot. India is investing a lot of effort in creating quality control regulations, so that not only we make in India, but we also create an ecosystem which understands the value of quality and which can become a critical part of the global value chains, which becomes the feedstock into finished products, into high value finished products. And that will only happen if the quality is controlled by each player and they understand why this is critical for becoming part of a global manufacturing ecosystem. Very recently, a National Research Foundation bill was passed. You may have tracked it. You may have heard about this, which promotes research between government, industry, and academia. So this is about having a better flow of R&D budgets in a way that the academia becomes the hub of research for emerging industrial technologies. So you basically collectivize research in a certain way, which can be used by different companies when the time is right. So not just the R&D done by the companies themselves, but the more upstream R&D or a more forward-looking R&D can happen within academia through the help of support, through the help or support of the government or the industry directly. And which is why you also see a much stronger defense industrial complex. So you may have come across the fact that India, which has been a net importer of weapons or arms or defense technologies for several years. We are in fact one of the biggest buyers actually in that space. India now exports about 2 billion of defense equipment, like we're starting practically from zero. So we have gone from 0 to 2 billion in about last 5 years, 5-6 years. And that is also showing up in the fact that India now has a very active, like a field gun that we have used. You must have heard about the MOU between the Hindustan Aeronautics Limited and GE Avionics, then something in the field of submarines being made in India. So I think there's a lot of activity which is going on in terms of understand, not just in terms of looking at trade as a simple question of having low or high tariffs. This is now being approached from a point of view of capability as to what do you need and what part of that has to be critically inside the country, because if you don't get it, there'll be a problem. So I think that a lot of the threats which are currently being enacted by different ministries or different policies which you see are an offshoot of that Atmanirbhar Bharat objective, where Atmanirbharta is about self-sufficiency. It is not about having just Indian companies involved in self-sufficiency. It is about having a network of trusted partners. They could be out from outside India, but they are making things in India. So I think that is the kind of a larger interplay between today's industrial policy and trade policy. And when you hear commentary around saying India's tariffs are high, or we are not being free enough, etc., I think some of this history will hopefully help you understand the nuances better and the imperatives better. So that was my presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Aashish. I'll just use one word: excellent. A lot of insights and educational as well, with current policy in the historical perspective. So who has got the questions they would like to ask?
So we have quite a few of them. We can start with Garimaji. If you could kindly unmute yourself and speak.
Hi, Aashish. Actually, my question was around, I work with the NGO and I interact with a lot of businesses usually as a part of my job. And I see that, a lot of policies are made with good intent, but the intent is not communicated well. So, for example, in the PLI scheme, the idea behind the scheme is to encourage scaling up of businesses, but how it is being communicated, and I come from electric vehicle community and I interact with a lot of these businesses, so it is discouraging small businesses. They feel that what is the use of PLI when small companies cannot make benefit out of it. So I think there is a gap in the intent, actual intent, and communication of that intent. So wanted to understand, how can we fill that gap? And yeah.
Sure. No, I think, I guess this question probably goes beyond the actual trade and industrial policy. I think communication is a broader issue here. But I think just to give you a perspective, I think, see, when you talk about, let's go back in history. Like, when say Japan or Korea talked about national champions, of course, you cannot create infinite number of national champions, right? You know where you have to have a targeted policy making. So PLI is no different per se in that sense. You cannot be funding like every company that is possible. You have to set some criteria, and the PLI criteria is fairly transparent, which is to say that you have to match certain. Every PLI has its own kind of design feature, right? So let me not kind of speculate, but there are such set of conditions to be met. And PLIs also have got differential conditions. So they may have a higher bar or a higher investment bar for a foreign company and a much lower investment bar for an Indian MSME, right? So there are all these design elements have been taken care of. Perhaps, the communication actually happens from each ministry. And since I'm inside the system, I can tell you that each ministry is not uniform in its own capability of how they are able to communicate the message. Some ministries are very good at it. Some ministries are still lagging. So it's a feedback which I can take back and let folks know. But no silver bullet here, unfortunately, to say that the government communication suddenly becomes very, very clear and and kind of open on day one.
Thank you, sir, for that answer. I now request Aashish ji to ask their question. We have another Aashish among us. Aashish Gosen ji, if you are here. If not, then we can go ahead with Saurav Patki ji.
Hi, Mr. Ashish. How are you? Very good lecture. Mr. Ashish, actually, I am from the energy sector. So my question was, in your vast experience, would you cite some examples of how policy intervention in terms of cross-border trade can also help improve diplomatic or government relations?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, actually. See, so WTO as a forum is the multilateral forum where international trade is governed, right?
Sure.
Now, this is in this forum, there is a way to ask questions of our other trade partners. So, for example, let's say if my companies are unable to export electric vehicles to, let's say, Nigeria, I mean, just as an example, then I can have a consultation with Nigeria saying that these are the problems being faced. Why don't you resolve these problems? Now, the thing is that this kind of feedback doesn't actually bubble up a lot in our system. I mean, given the fact that we are a big economy, we will soon be the third largest economy in the next, let's say, 5-6 years, or perhaps even earlier. We don't actually use these kind of mechanisms to create bilateral dialogue as much as we should. I mean, of course, we do raise questions, especially against big partners. But a lot more can be done on that part, which of course needs industry to understand what is WTO and the fact that there's a provision to ask these questions. And what happens what I've seen in my personal experience here in 2 years in Geneva is that when you talk to other countries, you are able to better explain your policies and you are able to better get a sense of their policies, right? So sometimes, okay, your industry is facing a challenge or their industry is facing a challenge in India. But if you are able to communicate what the background of that policy was or why they are doing something, this actually leads to a very good dialogue between typically our trading partners, which will also be important geopolitical players.
Sure.
And in that sense, if you coach these trade diplomats who are in Geneva about Indian policies or Indian imperatives, that then, I mean, they will eventually become ambassadors of their country to to India one day, or they may come to work in India, or they may become ambassadors to their country in WTO, where they have to deal with India again. So that creates a very good base, basically, for them to keep in mind. And hence, this conversation has got a great linkage into future geopolitical conversations. But the challenge is not very structured right now from our side, because we perhaps don't ask that many questions. And one reason is that the industry feedback doesn't bubble into the Department of Commerce as much as it should be doing. So we're kind of working on some of these things, but as you know, like in government, it takes time. So hoping that this communication mechanism also improves so that we can raise not just, explain our positions when there are challenges on the Indian side, but also ask questions of other countries when we see challenges on their policy, which would then lead to a much better, let's say, mutual understanding and hopefully geopolitical gains.
So any example you would like to highlight? I am from energy sector, sir. I work at Tata Power. So I see energy as a great potential, at least in our subcontinent, but, bearing a few cross-border power flow which happens, in the energy sector, we don't really see as much as a push as the potential exists. So, so apart from energy sector, are there any examples which stand out for you? It can be related to agriculture or anything which, so just from an example point of view.
Sure. No, I'll give you an example from agriculture, actually, since you mentioned that. So European Union has got several rules around what is called the maximum residual limit, or MRL. Okay. MRL is a concept which says that in a product which is coming to my border, the chemical component of, XYZ chemicals should be below a certain percentage point, right? Now, EU rules are very stringent around this, which is why EU doesn't import a lot of eatables from India, right?
Sure.
Or from, let's say, developing countries. So EU continues to change these rules and make it very complex. And we take it away regularly with EU, right? We have been fighting about this in several WTO forums for the last couple of years on how their MRL rules are hampering our exports. And then when you have this conversation, you have to tell EU that, see, my agriculture is not industrial in nature. We have got marginal farmers, we have got women working in agriculture. You are actually jeopardizing their livelihood. You are not letting them gain from the extent of trade which is possible, right? So through this conversation, although of course the problem has not been resolved, but we've been able to tell EU that because of their policies, our society is not able to benefit from the objectives of trade, one of which was sustainable development. So I think that this is a good example. I mean, if you read WTO documents, you will find some of this, our positions quite clear.
Great. Noted, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We can go ahead with Suvendu Chandji. You can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay. Hi. Greetings, Ashish. Good to see you in person. And thank you for your wonderful insights as always. I have a specific question, especially the way we are seeing the competitiveness, especially around the chip policy, the semiconductor manufacturing policies, and there is so much of pressure on countries like India, and especially in India, to shift its trade in certain way. So as the global economy, global trade policies become very combative and very competitive, what are the immediate top 2 to 3 measures the government is and should be taking or is taking to stay ahead of the curve and to protect its interest? Sure.
No, thanks, Suvendu. And like Professor Asher, I've also been talking to Suvendu for a long time digitally, but good to kind of e-meet today. And so I think in terms of manufacturing, Suvendu, of course, PLI is the linchpin of Indian policy, the PLI design. It covers sectors which are, so there are 2 types of sectors. One which are important today from the perspective of the fact that we are big consumers like electronics and telecom equipment, pharma. And then there are sectors of tomorrow, right? So like specialty steel or electric vehicles or batteries and all of that, right? So there's a mix of the sectors have been chosen quite carefully that you have, on one hand, you have impact immediately on our own consumption patterns. And on the other hand, you have a future looking perspective of controlling or hopefully influencing industries which will grow in the years to come.
Sure.
So that is one kind of an intervention. Secondly, if you see, like we recently signed the IPEF supply chain agreement. In fact, the text came out just the day before, I think. Even today in G20, you must have, I guess you might not have seen it, but one of the outcomes of G20 today was the corridor between India, Middle East, and Europe, infrastructure transportation corridor, right? This announcement just happened like an hour ago while you were probably listening to the GST lecture. So that kind of a connectivity announcement where you have, these things are very critical because when you have ease of, let's say, sending goods from one port to another, or for example, if the goods can come from Italy to India through network of countries like Greece and Cyprus or Israel and then Saudi, UAE and into India through a combination of sea transportation and rail transportation. So I think those kind of interventions ease out the connectivity issues and procedural issues, because import and export also is also about a lot of documentation, about bank guarantees, about checks done at the border, all kinds of procedural things are involved in it, right?
Right.
So I think these kind of understandings around procedures, digitizing of trade documents, recognizing each other's documents digitally without human intervention, right? Pre-certifying things which require some kind of a certification. So I think all those initiatives are being taken today, and they are being done in a way that when you can create trust. So for example, if 3 countries can agree that, okay, we trust what you are saying. So if you certify something, I will not recheck it, right, from my side.
Yep.
So I think those kind of arrangements are being put in place, which opens opportunities for the industry, both on the manufacturing side and then basically letting them, interact with the world in terms of facilitation of transportation and all of that. So I think that is the main kind of intervention today from in our policy.
Sure. Thank you very much, Ashish.
We have last 2 questions. Prajakta ji, you can go ahead. Kindly be brief in view of the time. Prajakta ji? If not, then we can go ahead with Tejas ji.
Hi, Ashish. Good evening. Again, pleasure to connect with you digitally over here while we have been on LinkedIn. So, Ashish, one of the great messages from the presentation is to create a resilient supply chain. And me being a supply chain professional can very well relate to that. However, you touched upon the point of certain protectionist measures that are being deployed by countries, and India also probably did that with respect to, the chip manufacturing, etc., which we want to go big in that. So how do we balance this particular aspect, and how does this come in the way of creating a diversified supply chain?
Great to meet Tejas again. We've been chatting
Yeah.
on LinkedIn, but I think the chips is a very specific type of area, Tejas. See, the fact is that everyone wants control on chips, right? So some level of competition is inevitable here. And you see that Germany attracted an Intel plant last month. US is, of course, trying to get new plants set up, including of TSMC. India is also seeing some investments, some early announcements from Micron and AMD and so on. Even NVIDIA made an announcement yesterday of partnering with Reliance and Tata. So I think you will not see a single strand here. When it comes to chips and semiconductors, you will see what I would call co-opetition, right? So there'll be cooperation and there'll be competition. But the idea is that some of the friendly countries can eventually work together to kind of stabilize things if there is a crisis in the future. But I think it's a very evolving area. It's a very dynamic, agile area, and it will probably take another 5-10 years to settle down.
Sure, thanks. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah. So,
Ashish, may I ask one question?
Yeah, of course, Professor.
India and US have just settled 7 disputes they had in WTO. Could you explain to our participants what implications does that have?
Yeah. So WTO, as I mentioned, has a dispute settlement facility. Currently, it is dysfunctional because the appellate body is dysfunctional, because US is not allowing. I mean, US is trying to reform that in the way they want it reformed. So there are several disputes which are stuck in WTO, which is that even if they have been cleared in the first panel, so like any dispute process, there are 2 stages. So you fight on stage 1, then if you lose, you can appeal into stage 2. The stage 2 is dysfunctional. So all these 7 disputes were lying in different stages where either we had won or US had won, etc. And then they were not, because other party couldn't appeal, or their appeal was not in a void, basically, because there is no appellate body. The final decision was not forthcoming. But it takes a lot of energy to kind of create these disputes alive, right? Because every month there's a meeting, you have to go say something, you have to prepare for it, you have to take industry feedback, both ways, us and the US as well. Then you have to keep fighting. Then if you think that the other guy is doing something wrong, then you put some unilateral measures, vice versa. Like, for example, when US enacted the Section 232 tariffs on steel, India did a retaliation by putting extra tariffs on some other US commodities, right? Now, the challenge is that it leads to a lot of compliance kind of work to be done by all border agencies. You have to track things, what is coming, consignment, rules of origin, all that has to be applied. So it's just a lot of administrative work while WTO dispute is not being taken to a logical conclusion. So what happened was that initially there were 6 disputes, where in 3 India was on a stronger wicket and on 3 US was on a stronger wicket. So those 6 were squared off, which is to say that there was some give and take, and some of the retaliatory duties which were put in by either side, and in some cases the US measure which was enacted, like on steel, so they would be more lenient about having Indian imports, stuff like that, right? So there's a give and take worked out, because there's a financial value to each of this give and take. You know that by if US is stopping your import of steel, how much import you have lost out on. Let's say, how much export have you lost out on? Say $200 million. While if you have put a retaliation of, let's say, extra duties on US apples, you know how many, like they've lost 50 million in Apple exports to India, for example. So you basically accumulate the wins and losses across these 6 disputes. And you arrive at a situation that, okay, if I do this and if you don't do this, etc., we come to a place where we net off or roughly net off our gains and losses. So that was the idea. In one particular dispute was also about our policy on where US had objected our policies on SEZs on the special economic zones, and also some of the policies on reimbursement of remission of taxes, etc. So that was an important one to be squared off, because we had lost the case in the first stage there, that the WTO panel had found that our SEZs were not, in the context of that dispute, were not compliant with some of the WTO rules. So I think that, we now get a much freer hand with that getting squared off, because if someone else has to start a dispute again about it, it will take years to get settled again, 5-6 years dispute settlement process. So I think that is the strategic gain here as well, that you basically are free to implement your policies, because the US, the sword hanging over your head, has now been taken away. And yesterday a 7th dispute was again settled, which US had already won in the dispute in the first stage. We had done some correction, but US was not happy about it, and so on. So this was a long-standing dispute for 9 years actually. So that has been settled as well by India backtracking on some of the additional duties which we had applied on US goods. So we still have duties in place, but additional duties have been removed in several cases. So what was being a retaliation duty has been taken away basically.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for sharing the insights.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me, and hope to stay in touch with the cohort. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. So
yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. It was a very informative session, and from the questions that we've had from the entire lot, it goes to show that how curious everyone is now. So thank you for that.
Thanks for that. I'll send you the presentation. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. As we come to an end of day 2 of a 1-month immersive online intermediate certificate training course on contours of the public policy in India in the Amrit Kaal, I, Tripta Behra, researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, would like to propose the formal vote of thanks on behalf of IMPRI Center for the Study of Finance and Economics, CSFE, New Delhi. We are very grateful to our experts for day 3 of this course, Mr. V. Ramakrishnan, Professor Sacchidananda Mukherjee, and Mr. Aashish Chandorkar, for taking out their valuable time and giving an opportunity to the participants to learn from this online certificate program. We thank all of our participants who have raised pertinent questions and actively participated in today's deliberation. We look forward to welcoming you next week, which is the 15th of September at 6 p.m. for the 4th day of this certification course by distinguished experts Professor Shobhit Mathur and Mr. Prakash Singh. We are grateful if you are watching us later on YouTube or listening to us on our various podcasts or reading our publications. We hope you continue to join in future to our IMPRI Web Policy Talk and Web Policy Learning. Wishing you all a very good evening. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Have a nice evening.